All right, welcome back to Computer Science 164. This is lecture 2. So today we dive a bit more into MVC as well as into database design, and we'll look in particular at Project Zero and courses.xml, with which hopefully you have struggled a little bit. And we will see through a series of Q&A if you can show off with your brilliant designs, or if there's still an opportunity before Friday to tweak or improve upon based on what some of your classmates say here. So just a heads up that lab tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday, will be same time, same place. This is in Pierce 301, schedules on the website, and this week's focus will be some more advanced techniques with Git, particularly ones that will help you work with a partner without colliding with each other's changes of code, and then also looking at databases and the M in MVC for model. So MVC, what was this all about? What was the point of introducing this construct in the first place? What do you got? Yes, Carl. Okay, good. So having separate logic for each component, so to speak, of your application so that you can change each one individually. What else motivated this notion of MVC as opposed to just writing raw PHP like you might have done in 50?
Separate the presentation from the logic of the data?
Yeah, so particularly separate presentation from logic. So the C is controller, the V is view, and those are meant to conjure up the idea that those two can and probably should be separate for any number of reasons. Why should your views, why should your data be kept separate from the actual logic of your program? Yeah.
So you can render different views on different platforms?
Yeah, perfect. So you can render different views. If you want to have a mobile view, you want to have a desktop view, you want to have an iPad-specific view, it's just so much easier if you only have to change code in one place. Moreover, all you have to change is the fluffy aesthetic code, and you don't actually have to change any of your database queries, any of your controller code, so to speak. It makes it much easier to alter just parts of your system. Anything else? Yeah.
So you don't expose your backend code?
Yeah, so you can also isolate front-end code from back-end code. And by front-end, we generally mean HTML, CSS, JavaScript, this kind of stuff. And back-end would be your MySQL calls or your raw XML files, anything that doesn't need to be web accessible. And indeed, that's why we introduced this whole notion of vhost. So back in the day when you first learned to make websites, you probably used public HTML. And the downside of using public HTML is that typically you just throw everything in there. And you rely on security through obscurity. You sort of cross your fingers that no one knows you have an includes directory inside of which is a config.php file or something similar. And why? What's the concern about keeping something like config.php or the like inside public HTML? Yeah?
It has like your API keys and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to have sensitive information, probably a database username and password, maybe some API key from some third-party website. And in short, if something goes wrong with your website, you screw up the open bracket question mark tag, or you mess up the configuration of your web server like we did last week, it's relatively easy to accidentally just expose your raw code so that the PHP interpreter does not actually execute that code, rather the web server just spits it out. So you want to not trust yourself. And so thus we introduce much more of a directory structure, and vhosts help us create the illusion that all of that stuff lives in the root of a web server. So this painted the picture of MVC, and we focused last week on controller and view. We didn't really have a model because I pretty much just hard-coded the links that I wanted to have for each lecture and for each video and for the syllabus right into my views. But today we can improve upon that a little bit and take advantage of some of CodeIgniter's features that facilitates this. So you'll probably or hopefully have mixed feelings by the end of a week or two from now with CodeIgniter. On the one hand, hopefully it does actually simplify some things and allows you to whip up fairly quickly the skeleton of a website, but hopefully over time, if not immediately, you'll get frustrated perhaps with some of the design decisions that the authors of this framework made. And I think you'll find this in general. There's so many PHP in particular frameworks out there of varying degrees of quality. CodeIgniter's upside is that it's actually relatively simple. It's a nice, gentle introduction to MVC, but hopefully as you get more comfortable or more sophisticated with your designs, you'll start to be frustrated by the fact that you're now relying on this framework. And we'll see similar tensions perhaps with Xcode when you pretty much have to code in accordance with the APIs Apple has given you. So this is just the fluffy picture that CodeIgniter presents that really does kind of depict the whole workflow. So if you had trouble wrapping your mind around what happened, really you can think of it in these terms, whereby index.php was, recall, the main controller for all of CodeIgniter. It was the only thing last week that was in the HTML directory. Everything else was in a directory called system or application, and we'll see that again in a bit. And that's totally CodeIgniter specific. This isn't some fundamental web concept. It's just their particular design. But what's interesting about CodeIgniter is when an HTTP request, whether GET or POST or something else, comes into that index.php file, there's logic in there and in related files that figures out how to route that request to the appropriate controller. And the simplest way that CodeIgniter does this is just by looking at the URL itself. So this is a canonical excerpt from their own documentation, whereby if your website is example.com and the user visits /foo/bar/baz, foo, bar, and baz are interpreted to be each of these placeholders here. So /foo means go find the foo.php controller that I created, specifically call the bar method inside of the foo class, and then pass into that bar method the arguments that I've passed along the end there. So if we made this a little more real, if we had something like, let me do this on a separate line. So if it were example.com/lectures, because I want the lectures controller to see all of the lectures for a course. But you know what? I specifically want a specific lecture, so I might further refine it like that. And the lecture I want is to, a URL like this could be automatically resolved by CodeIgniter or any similar framework to invoke the lectures controller, the lecture method within, and it's going to pass in an argument of literally the number 2. So none of this was, all of this was possible when you only had HTTP gets and posts, and we typically used ampersands and question marks to pass in HTTP parameters. But there's definitely a trend these days toward prettier URLs, things that just have slashes and tokens in them and not question marks, ampersands, and the like. And just to remind, why? What was one of the values of having slightly sexier URLs like this than things with lots of question marks, ampersands, and equal signs? Yeah? Yeah, so that's one of the biggies, just search engines. Because a typical search engine like Google, if it sees a URL that has a question mark and a whole bunch of parameters, typically it's going to ignore those parameters, at least in terms of the listings that you put in a search engine, because they're assumed to be dynamically generated. And if you individually indexed every page on the internet that took HTTP parameters, you would just mushroom the number of web pages there. So this is a way of sort of telling forcibly the internet that you actually do care that there is content specifically at this destination. So it turns out, though, that this doesn't just work so easily right out of the box. So let me go into the appliance. And this was the example from last time. So this is the very last one we did, which was example 8. And in example 8, we had our little home page here with lectures and syllabus. And if I go ahead and click on lectures, I then notice the URL changes to be /lecture. If I click lecture 0, notice the URL changes. Not quite as I just promised. We're actually going to clean this up a little bit. But notice that, notice that the URL right now is /lecture/0. And all of the other directories, of course, are just for lecture's sake. In a normal website, we would probably get rid of MVC and 8 and HTML. So it turns out that what you're really seeing here, let me go back to the first page here. /HTML index.php/lectures. And there's actually a non-trivial number of student groups on campus that run like MediaWiki installations, which is like Wikipedia software, or WordPress installations, where you see, frankly, these horrific looking URLs, where you see index.php in all of the URLs, and then some stuff after it. So what's actually going on here? So this is actually a web server trick. One of the nice things about web servers today, and the fact that we run one on the appliance, is you have very low level control over how requests are handled. And so this is actually the reference. This is actually the URL of a file. Index.php was that controller that we talked about earlier. But take a look at what's actually been inside of that directory. And from lab 1 and also from the project, you might have seen this already. If I do ls, all right, I just see my usual files. But if I do -al, I see everything. And inside of this is htaccess. So this is an Apache convention. Apache being one of the most popular web server software out there. This one specifically for Linux. And in here is this little trick. So this is an example of this is an example of a fairly complex but powerful feature of Apache where you can rewrite things as much as you want. This is a means by which you can hide the PHP extension on all of your files, which these days looks a little ugly. If you see .php, .html, you can hide all of that by, so to speak, rewriting things. So from top to bottom, it's fairly straightforward. The top line just means turn this feature on. The second line is necessary only for lecture's sake in that we have we're not using the base URL of the website, but rather we are using /MVC/8/HTML. But what do you think the third line is saying? It's a condition, so it's sort of a weird way of writing an if-else. Go back to sort of the basics. Like they're just stealing syntax that we've used in other languages. So exclamation point. Not, our index.php, index.php. The backslash is probably there because just escape it, right? Otherwise, it would be any character, a wildcard. $1 is actually, you wouldn't really know this necessarily, and it's a little weird. We don't have a pointer here just yet. So the $1 is referring sort of forward-thinking wise to whatever's going to be matched in parentheses on the next line. So by next line, I mean, that's OK. I'll find one later. So the next line is saying, all right, go ahead and match everything after the slash in the original URL and store it in a temporary variable, $1 by default, and it's the parentheses that do this. If you know PHP and you've used preg match before, you have the same notion of capturing parentheses. And what it's saying is, if so long as the file that was requested is not bang index.php, go ahead and pass this HTTP request along to, in the fourth line, that file index.php, but pass after it the slash file name that was actually originally requested. So in other words, if the user has not explicitly requested index.php, pretend that they have, and append to the end of that file name whatever was in the original URL. So what CodeIgniter is then capable of doing in its own index.php file, it has the ability through PHP's super globals, if you recall $_server and the like, to see what exactly was appended at the end of the file name that's in the URL that was requested. And it realizes, oh, that's /foo/bar/baz. Let me now require once foo.php. Let me go ahead and call the bar method, and let me pass to the bar method the very last thing at the end of that URL. So that's all that's happening there, and it's not even strictly necessary. It's really ultimately just an aesthetic detail so that your URLs don't look like, for instance, this here. Yeah?
I had a question. On the third line, the dot was not escaped with the backslash?
On the third, correct. So on the third line, it's actually not a regular expression that we're using. The third line is literally map this to index.php. So it's only the third line that involves a regex. So this is worth drawing your attention to, too, because right now we are saying that any request for a file other than index.php itself should get mapped to index.php. In other words, if I request /foo/bar/baz, actually pass that to index.php /foo/bar/baz. But what if the file the user is actually requesting is hello.jpg? Well, what's going to happen there? Well, a request for example.com /hello.jpg is actually going to get resolved to example.com /index.php /hello.jpg. Bad, right? Because that's obviously not the actual graphic file. So among the things you'll have to bear in mind is as you design this and future sites, and you actually have assets like CSS and JavaScript and images, realize that this dark magic actually does need to be tweaked so that you're not routing absolutely everything. And if you look in CodeIgniter's documentation, there's more sophisticated ways of doing this, so you don't have to hard code every possible file that you want to whitelist.
What does the L mean at the end of the fourth line?
L just means last. So if you had other rewrite rules, this one would say stop executing here once it's matched. Another hand somewhere? Yeah?
How do you handle like more RESTful routes?
More RESTful routes? In what sense here?
In terms of like mapping the same thing, if it's like a get or a post or a request.
Well, so we'll talk about REST later this semester, but for those unfamiliar, it essentially means using URLs to identify resources on a server. I mean, this can be used in precisely the same way to represent REST endpoints, whereby your REST endpoint could just be a controller that this then maps a request to.
But for like code now, do you have to do all through basically rewrite rules, or is it like?
No. OK, no. I see where you're going. So short answer, no. And we'll see that in just a second. But for now, all this does is it gets rid of the ugliness of index.php, but it can certainly do much more. All right. So what was bad then about this design? So let me go into version 8 here and recall that we had a whole bunch of files. And they're summarized here in the README that accompanies each of these things. So we introduced last week CodeIgniter. And CodeIgniter came with a whole bunch of default directories, among which were application, among which was system, and among which was index.php.